Saeed, professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University. He is also my former colleague where I was at the University of Chicago, where he taught before he went to Columbia and before I came here. He's the author of many books. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale and his D.Phil from Oxford. He's been the editor of the journal, and still is editor of the Journal for Palestine Studies, president of the Middle East Studies Association, was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and other talks, peace negotiations. He's written extensively on Middle East history, but also on contemporary affairs, is a quite visible public intellectual on those matters, has received grants from the MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, Woodrow Wilson, International Center for Scholars, and a number of other foundations as well. He's going to be talking primarily about his new book, Brokers of Deceit, and there will be a book signing afterwards over at the Harvard Coop, as we say it here. But also other books like The Iron Cage, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, Under Siege, PLO Decision-Making During the 1982 War, and The Origins of Arab Nationalism. He's received the Arab American National Museum Book Award for The Iron Cage and won the Middle East Studies Association's Albert Harani Book Award not once but twice for Resurrecting Empire, one of his other books, and Palestinian Identity. It is a real pleasure to welcome Rashid here, and he will speak for perhaps 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then take questions from the audience. So without further ado, Rashid Khalidi.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you all for coming. I have been touring to talk about this book, and is this working?
This one isn't on.
This one isn't on, so let me grab your mic. There we go. Is that better? Yeah. I've been traveling around with this book, and I've done this kind of thing before, and I have to say, I have a feeling something is changing in this country. More rapidly than I would otherwise have suspected. When we finish and get to questions, I'd be happy to tell you what I think might have been some of the reasons for this. I think the book that Professor Walt and my other former colleague John Mearsheimer wrote together may have played a little bit of a role in that. But anyway, in preparation for the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991, the United States sent a letter of assurance to every one of the parties involved. It sent a letter to the Palestinians. And the letter to the Palestinians promised that the United States would oppose actions that were described as prejudicial or precedential to negotiations. In other words, anything that might prejudice negotiations, anything that might serve as a precedent, a negative precedent, the United States would oppose. This was one of many assurances that the United States gave to the Palestinians that it did not remain faithful to. In the same letter, the United States promised, I'm now quoting the letter of assurances, that the United States will act as an honest broker. Similarly, if you go on the Al Jazeera and Guardian websites where they have the papers of later negotiations from the Clinton and Bush administrations leaked by Palestinian negotiators, you will find a document in which minutes of a meeting in which Dr. Condoleezza Rice told the Palestinian delegation that she wanted to meet with them privately, and now I'm quoting what the Secretary of State said, so I can tell you what I think of your positions without hurting my role as the honest broker. So here we have, from 1991 to 2006, two Secretaries of State, Secretary Baker, Secretary Rice, both asserting that the United States serves as an honest broker, as between the Palestinians and the Israelis. These two documents, these two statements, reiterate what I describe as a central myth about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is that the United States serves as a fair mediator, as an honest broker between the two sides. What I assert in this book, what anyone with eyes to see, I think, could see, is that in fact the United States has operated in a thoroughly one-sided fashion as between these two parties. In consequence, I argue, the United States has not just watched over this conflict, it has actively exacerbated and worsened it by its own actions and its own inactions. And it has exacerbated a conflict which, according to another myth, is one between near equals, the Israelis and the Palestinians. I won't go into the details of how imbecilic an idea it is to put the Palestinians and the Israelis on the same level. But that is something that is more or less generally assumed by many people. In reality, as anybody who's ever been there or paid any attention to strategic balances or reality would immediately notice, this is a conflict between a powerful, dominant Israeli state, supported by the greatest power in world history, and a divided, oppressed Palestinian people, a minority of whom have lived under Israeli military occupation since 1967, which in June will enter its 47th year, and the rest of whom have been dispersed forcibly from their homeland back in 47, 48, 49. I argue in this book, in fact, I start with an epigraph from George Orwell, and I argue in this book that language has enormous importance in the construction of these myths. This was something that I asserted in an early draft of the book, and a friend of mine is an English professor at Chicago, Jim Chandler, said to me, you can't just start with Orwell and not continue. So I tried to sustain this argument all through the book. Orwell wrote in 1946, and I'm now quoting him, that the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. And I think that the framing of this conflict using terms like honest broker, or using an equally deceitful term like peace process, many, many others, have served to mask a bitter reality, which is one not just of the United States taking sides in this conflict, but of actual American complicity with Israel and its continued dominance over the Palestinians. And as I've said, I think that this has made the prospects of a settlement much, much less likely. And I assert in the book that this distortion of language made a really important contribution to this by corrupting thought and cloaking the real nature of this outcome. Any of you who watch our politicians talk about this, any of our politicians virtually talk about this, any of you who pay attention to the mainstream media will know what I'm talking about. I think that this language conceals a number of things, but one of them is how closely our country's policy has become entwined with Israeli policy. In doing my research for this book, I was reminded of something that I had sort of knew but had put in the back of my mind, and I cite it in the introduction. And this is what I think is a very important document in which this complicity is grounded. This was a letter that President Ford sent to then Prime Minister Rabin in 1975, in which the United States agreed, and I'm now quoting this letter, which was kept secret for a while, but it's now known in public. The United States agreed, and I'm quoting now, to coordinate with Israel with a review to refraining from putting forth proposals that Israel would consider unsatisfactory. On the Palestine issue, Israel vets anything the United States says, as long as the United States chooses to remain faithful to its commitment that President Ford issued. Now, I argue in this book that there are three major commitments the United States has made to the Palestinians, all of which it has betrayed. But as I argue also in this book, its commitments to Israel tend to be kept, and this one has been. Logically, a commitment like this level of complicity, should have disqualified the United States from playing the role of intermediary between these antagonists. Of course, it did not. Now, when I talk about this, people sometimes object. They say, but the United States has served as a mediator in other conflicts in the Middle East, between Arab countries and Israel. And in fact, that's true. I go in detail into a few of them. I talk about the disengagement agreements of 1975-76 between Egypt and then Syria and then Egypt again. I talk about the Camp David Accords insofar as they related to Egypt and Israel. I talk about the peace treaty of 1979. These are all cases where the United States did act effectively, actually. What I argue in the book, though, is that the reason had very little to do with Middle East peace per se. It had to do with the urgent necessity of diffusing a potential superpower conflict and the wonderful prize of establishing American ascendancy in the Middle East in the Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union by winning Egypt over from the Soviet camp and into the American camp. These were perceived as vital objectives. And there, the United States acted effectively. I could list other instances where the United States acted in service of Cold War objectives or in service of major economic or strategic interests in ways that paid very little attention to the kind of closeness that one usually associates with American-Israeli relations. However, with regard to the Palestinians and the Israelis, we actually have a track record of 35 years since President Carter sat down at Camp David with President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin. And in those 35 years of American initiatives that are ostensibly directed at achieving peace, we've had a great deal of process, but we haven't had peace. And so this is a case where I would argue there has not been effective mediation at all. In fact, there's been a degree of bias that has prevented that. I argue in this book that to understand this, it's not necessary to look at the entire history of American Middle East policy or even the entire history of American policy towards Palestine. I do go back to 1945. I talk about President Roosevelt, President Truman, talk a little bit about other earlier episodes. But I focus on 3 episodes in this book, 3 moments of what I call moments of clarity in the history of American policy on Palestine. The first was in the summer of 1982. The second was during the negotiations I participated in from 91 to 93, followed by the Oslo Accords, in which I did not participate, and subsequent Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. And the third moment of clarity came during President Obama's first term in office. And I argue that these 3 episodes are sufficient to show, to prove, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, the points that I'm making here. In regard to the first of them, what happened in 1982, this was at the end of the Lebanon War, following Israel's invasion. We forget that Israel's invasion of Lebanon created 50,000 Palestinian and Lebanese casualties, 18,000 killed, and over 30,000 wounded. At the end of that conflict, once the ceasefire had been achieved, the Reagan administration viewed the situation as an enormous improvement in Cold War terms. Soviet proxies had been defeated, an American ally was victorious, and they saw it as time for the president to launch an initiative which would sort of seal the package. And this was the Reagan Plan of September 1st, 1982. And I found particularly revealing, with relation to this episode, a newly declassified document, the author is redacted, it's a CIA document, produced in order to assess how Begin would react to the changes in the American position that it was proposed to make in the Reagan Plan. What President Reagan hoped to do was to make the autonomy accords between Israel, Egypt, and the United States that had been signed at Camp David interpret them slightly more favorably to the Palestinians. As you may remember, these accords were stillborn, even though the Egyptian-Israeli side of Camp David produced a peace treaty, the Palestinian aspect went nowhere. Essentially because Begin had dug in his heels. It insisted that even though he would accept the Palestinians have autonomy, that could not include self-determination, it could not include Palestinian control over land and water, it could not include an end to Israeli settlement expansion. In other words, it couldn't include any element of real autonomy. Another example of Orwellian language, autonomy without autonomy. So what the president was proposing to do was to try and interpret these accords slightly more favorably to the Palestinians in the Reagan Plan, and the CIA assessment was of what Begin would do. And the memo said that, of course, the prime minister was likely to dig his heels in. And I'm now quoting this declassified CIA assessment. The accords, in Begin's view, the accords, I quote, guarantee that under no condition can a Palestinian state be created. In other words, Begin felt that he had guaranteed the impossibility of the creation of a Palestinian state at Camp David in 1978. And I continue reading from this document. In practice, Begin effectively ruled out any exercise of Palestinian self-determination, except one that continued Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank. Now, how you can have Palestinian self-determination and Israel maintaining a preeminent position in the West Bank and do that within the bounds of the English language is beyond me, but this is a CIA analyst. He's not a professor. Chandler at the University of Chicago English Department. I found this very revealing. In fact, I found that this document, written in August of 1982, perfectly described not just what Begin would say, and not just Begin's position. It described Israel's position from that moment onwards until this day. It described the Oslo Accords. It described Palestinian autonomy. It described the situation today. No Palestinian state, Israeli control over land and water, unlimited continued expansion of settlements. What Begin wanted in 1977 when he came into office, what this analyst said he would try to do, is what has happened and what was consecrated, in my view, in Oslo. I found that revealing, but I found it equally revealing that President Reagan was completely unable to hold firm to the positions that he enunciated publicly on September 1st. The Reagan plan died without a trace, never implemented. Nothing happened. Begin held firm, exactly as this analyst suggested, and nothing happened. It wasn't the last time that American policymakers were to back down in the face of Israeli stubbornness on these issues. So that was the first set of events. I go back and talk about 78 Camp David a little bit in dealing with it. The second set of events had to do with the period that I was myself involved in. As Steve said, I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation. In consequence, I collected a very large trove of documents, some of which were produced by the Palestinian delegation, some of which were minutes of meetings with the American and Israeli side, some of which were Israeli documents, some of which were American documents that were given to us. And I'd always wanted to use them, and it was not until a graduate student of mine was working on Carter and Reagan policy that I saw some of the documents he was working on, and I realized nothing has changed. Everything has very much been the same between the period that he was working on, the Carter-Reagan period, the period that I was involved in, and in fact, the Obama administration. These documents that I had in my possession, and 15 of which, if you buy the book, you will see not just references to them, but you will get a website where you can go online and actually read them in the original form. 15 of these documents, heretofore unpublished and never before seen by human eyes except the negotiators themselves. These documents expose this high degree of coordination and, I would argue, complicity between the United States and Israel. They expose as well the extraordinary timidity of American diplomats in refusing to go beyond what they mistakenly believed were Israeli red lines. They were afraid of their own shadows. They didn't actually push the Israelis at all up to what were the real Israeli red lines. This reached the point in May of 1993 when the United States put forward a so-called bridging proposal. There's one of the minutes of one of the meetings talks about this. A bridging proposal that was supposed to bring the two sides closer together, which was actually less forthcoming than the last position the Israelis had communicated to us. I mean, what use is a mediator who is not even willing to go as far as one of the two sides? I mean, they're so, as we said to ourselves, they're more Israeli than the Israelis. And I thought, well, maybe this was an aberration, maybe this was an anomaly. I was later on reading the documents produced in the 2006-2008 negotiations under President Bush, and I found another instance, identical instance, of American mediators going less far than the Israelis had gone privately. As I've already said, what these documents that I talk about in regard to the first moment, the Begin stuff of about 1982, and what the material that I had in my possession for the 91-93 period show, was what I found to be a remarkable continuity in the Israeli position. Even more surprising to me was that even after Prime Minister Rabin came in and changed a great deal in the Israeli position, the basic position on autonomy didn't change. Rabin recognized that there was a Palestinian people. Rabin recognized that the PLO represented it. Rabin agreed to negotiate with the PLO. Rabin agreed to allow the PLO and its forces to enter into the occupied territories. Neither of his Likud predecessors would have accepted any of those things. So Rabin significantly changed the Israeli position. He did not accept Palestinian self-determination or statehood, of course. He did not allow for a reciprocal recognition of the two peoples in the Oslo Accords. But he did make those changes. However, what I found is that as far as the terms of autonomy, what Rabin would accept for the Palestinians, he actually didn't go much beyond what Begin had laid down. I would argue that the core position, I've already said, I don't think the core position of any Israeli government has really gone beyond that. In terms of accepting genuine Palestinian independence, or ending Israel's effective control over the entirety of the occupied territories, or its colonization of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So that's the second moment. The third moment you all know, it was President Obama's staking out positions in the first couple of years of his presidency, which he humiliatingly retreated from in the last 2 years of his presidency. I needn't say much more about that. There's a whole chapter about that. That is the third moment. I would argue these moments of clarity, if read in the context of the documents that I provide, and in the Obama chapter, what I do is I read the president's speeches as carefully as I can. I suggest you read very carefully his speech in Jerusalem. Read very carefully, not just his speeches to AIPAC, his speeches to the UN General Assembly. Read all of his speeches. And what you'll see is an essentially Israeli narrative. I mean, it could be torn from the pages of Leon Uris's Exodus, some of the more the rhapsodies of his prose, written, we now know, by a gentleman of 35 years. I hope he's not a graduate of the Kennedy School, but he may be. By the name of Ben Rhodes. There's a wonderful article on him in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. These three moments of clarity, I think, prove conclusively things that are thoroughly obfuscated in most of the writing on the subject, which talks about a peace process, which in my view has not really existed, and obscure the fact that whatever process the United States was actually championing, it was not directed at achieving a just and lasting peace. I will discuss with you, if you're interested, what that would involve, but those are not the things the United States has worked towards. Immediate end to the occupation, actual self-determination. Whatever presidents have said, and many of them talked about a Palestinian state, what they have done in practice has not worked in that direction. Instead of trying to achieve real goals that would actually achieve a resolution of this conflict on a just and lasting basis, what American presidents and their secretaries of state and national security advisors have actually done, in my view, has been to pressure the weaker Palestinians into conforming to the desiderata of their stronger opponents. There are other objectives, domestic political objectives. I suggest in this book that whereas the Israel lobby and Israel's ability to dig in its heels on issues which is legendary in its negotiations with American diplomats and policymakers, is almost only really visible on the Palestine issue. On issues of great strategic importance to the United States, however obstinate Israeli leaders may be, however vocal the lobby may be, the United States invariably gets its way. Invariably. I cite a few cases in the book. I could talk about this more. What I'm arguing here is that it's only on Palestine that the core dynamics at work have been domestic politics. On other issues of strategic importance to the United States, whether it's Suez 1956, whether it's the Rogers Plan and imposing a ceasefire disadvantageous to Israel at the end of the War of Attrition, whether it's the agreements in the 1970s, including the peace treaty, we now have the diplomatic documents, and we know how much resistance Israel put up and how much bludgeoning American diplomats had to do, and how the United States invariably got its way. So what I'm arguing here is that where real strategic importance is attached to an end, the lobby and Israeli obstruction don't really count for very much. I could go into this if any of you are interested. I could talk about things like the AWACS sales and the F-15 sales in the 70s and the 80s, because I think they reveal yet another aspect of this, which is the complicity not just of the United States with Israel, but of Saudi Arabia and the Arab oil-producing countries of the Gulf with the United States in going along with this. When I talk about the Arab countries and their role in the Palestine question, I describe them as Sherlock Holmes's dog that did not bark. You have these countries that have this enormous potential leverage over the United States, but in fact, it is the United States that has leverage over them. I could go into this, I could discuss it. I have a long passage and lengthy passages in the book. But I would argue that these are countries that are weak, have a lack of domestic legitimacy. None of them are democracies with the sole exception, partial exception of Kuwait. And so the Arab oil-producing countries are very dependent on the United States and have not exerted pressure on the United States. This goes right back to 1945. In 1945, President Roosevelt made the first really important American pledge on Palestine. He had just met with Ibn Saud in March of that year on his way back from Yalta. He was already dying. He was exceedingly ill. He wasted a whole day meeting with him because of what the State Department called Saudi Arabia being the greatest strategic prize in world history. They knew how much oil was there already. So the president met with this potentate. And after the meeting, he sent him a letter in April. And he made two promises. The first promise was the United States would do nothing to harm the Arabs of Palestine. And if you believe that promise has been kept, you're living in another universe. And he promised always to consult with the Arabs over Palestine. Neither of those pledges were kept. In fact, Truman denied the pledges had ever been made until the State Department showed him the documents, and we have to accept that they had been made. But he was not faithful to them. And the Saudis did nothing about it. As late as 1948, after the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry in 1946 asked for 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to be allowed to enter Palestine, after the United Nations vote for partition, which the United States pushed through. After the United States recognized Israel in 1948, the Saudis said so little that Secretary of State Marshall was able to write a letter to the Saudi king thanking him for his conciliatory manner over Palestine. The dog that did not bark. And I would argue this continued right up through the oil embargo, where the Saudis did bark. But in fact, their bark, as it were, was worse than their bite. to the degree that Secretary Kissinger in his memoirs said, and I'm quoting Kissinger, "The rhetoric of Saudi diplomats on behalf of the Arab cause was impeccable and occasionally intransigent, but behind the scenes Saudi policy was almost always helpful to American diplomacy." So this is a basic pattern, and I think it explains why on the Palestine issue the Israel lobby has the kind of valence that it does. I think it gives you the sort of strategic background to this. There is, in effect, no contradiction between the American strategic interests involved in alignment with these Arab oil-producing monarchies and overwhelming American support for Israel. In fact, the two alliances with Saudi Arabia and with Israel are not contradictory. They are actually complementary. And I argue this in the book. If things in the Arab world change, if democratization is in fact the result, lasting, sustained democratization is in fact the result of whatever is happening in some of the Arab countries, and there's a big if. Nobody knows whether that will happen. I'm not a political scientist. I wouldn't even presume to tell you what might happen. My colleagues in that august discipline. I can tell you maybe how we got to where we are with some luck, maybe, but I can't tell you where we may be going. But if there is such change in the direction of sustained democratization, I would suggest that Arab governments would become like today's Turkish government. They would actually have to reflect what their people want on this issue. And their people do not want their governments to lie down, roll over, and play dead when the United States massively supports Israel. They would really like a fairer shake for the Palestinians. Almost everybody in every Arab country, in every poll ever taken, says that. No Arab government represents its people, therefore, that's not the policy of these governments. When and if these governments come to represent their people, my suggestion would be that the policy that has been successfully pursued since President Truman will become much more difficult to pursue. Let me conclude by saying that the United States has not just been guilty of inaction on this issue. Its inaction has produced all kinds of outcomes, which are, in my view, such as to make, for example, a two-state solution, the possibility of a Palestinian state, impossible, untenable. Going from the 200,000 settlers living in Arab East Jerusalem and the West Bank when we went to Madrid in 1991 to nearly 600,000 today, that's an outcome that changes possibilities. What might have been doable in 1991, in my view, is virtually not doable today. 1 in 10 Jewish Israelis now live in the settlements. 1 in 10 Israeli voters now live in the settlements. What politician is going to spit at 1 in 10 voters? So you're talking about facts on the ground, not just the settlements, the matrix of control, the belief among Israelis that they must control the Palestinians in order to have any kind of safety, all kinds of things that have been entrenched in Israeli thinking and in Israeli policy, Israeli action, ever since ever since the beginning of the occupation, and which I think United States policy has helped to consecrate. These are things that have made a settlement much more difficult. I think there has, in fact, not just been inaction, there has been action. Politicians and policymakers and the media talk about the United States as if it's somewhere in the middle. The United States gives $3 billion in military aid to Israel annually. It has given Israel $115 billion since the beginning, most of that since 1973. That plays a big role in producing outcomes. Tax-free dollars flow to the settlements. 501c3s that are supposedly charities funnel hundreds of millions of dollars a year to the most extremist, dangerous people in the occupied territories. That's American money that Americans don't pay taxes on. We pay taxes instead to make up for the loss to the Treasury. And that money supports things which are illegal in international law and which are against U.S. policy. I mean, these are outcomes we are responsible for. This is not just, oh, it happened. It happened because that's the way the Treasury, that's the way the IRS choose to interpret our law. There are many other examples of this. All of this is shielded from the American public, what the mainstream media tells them, what their politicians tell them, what the presidents have told them, is, in my view, debased rhetoric about a peace process which is not produced and cannot produce and will not produce peace. What has happened, what we are complicit in, our country is complicit in, is the continuation and intensification of the dispersal, the occupation, and the colonization of the Palestinians. That's the process. That's what's happening. Peace is not in any way commensurate with those outcomes, and those are the outcomes. In fact, our country is not an honest broker. Our country, in the words of someone who put this in an op-ed and later in a book, Aaron David Miller, who was involved for decades in this process, is serving as Israel's lawyer. And Miller tells us in a footnote he didn't even make the term up. He took it from Henry Kissinger, who should know. So that's where I argue we are. It took a great deal of what George Orwell called corrupt language to conceal these realities. Thank you very much.